Alrighty, with Etheria Restart releasing in just a few days, I figured now would be a good time to release a guide on the two PvE modes that you guys will be farming the most, Grim Pursuit and Threshold. And as you can see, I've switched back to a PowerPoint format. Those of you who used to watch my One Punch Man guys might feel a little bit of nostalgia. But enough about that. In today's video, I'll be going over the two game modes that I'll be covering, Grim Pursuit and Threshold, the boss's mechanics, as well as usable characters or recommended characters that I would recommend for each of the varying stages. Without further ado, let's begin. Starting off with Grim Pursuit and the first boss, Shadow Runner. He's going to be the second Grim Pursuit boss that you end up facing, and honestly he's not that difficult, but he is quite important. He'll be one of the first bosses that I recommend actually farming for the shells. As a result, regardless, I'll be going over his mechanics and how to beat him. So Shadow Runner inflicts DOT stacks, and upon 4 stacks, he'll actually stun the character who has that many stacks on them. And in order to counteract this, basically what you would want to do is to rush down the boss or Shadow Runner before he's able to do so, and completely ignore the mobs to the side. And Shadow Runner is actually going to be the very first boss that drops the first worthwhile unique shell rarity, or the purple grade rarity, Unbridled Science, which is the first one here. This pet pushes your character's turn meter up after they've taken their turn, so a very universally good pet on both supports, damage dealers, healers, any sort of character will benefit from the turn meter push. So a very good beginner and early on pet you can invest into. The next Grim Pursuit boss I'll be covering is and he is actually going to be the first major DPS check when it comes to these Grim Pursuit bosses. You're going to need a lot or a very relatively strong AoE damage to clear this boss, because the whole mechanic for this boss is you have to clear out his ads before you can even damage him himself. Or you can damage him, but he has like 90% damage reduction, so essentially he's invincible. And he's actually going to drop the second worthwhile unique shell, or purple grade shell, the Princess Mermaid, which is the third purple shell here. It is a cleanser type of shell that removes 2 to 3 debuffs from your character at the beginning of their turn, depending on your ascension level. And that is a very, very good shell, especially for your healers. Later on, when you get higher rarity shells, you can even pass it down to some of your supports, maybe even some of your DPS characters, although it's not as optimal. It's still better than the remaining purple or unique grade shells in my opinion. And since Kuru, in my opinion, is going to be like the first roadblock or DPS check out of all the bosses, unlike the Shadow Runner, who is relatively easy, I'm actually going to give you guys some suggested or recommended animuses. Let's start off with your main damage dealer. The highest recommended animus I would recommend is Leanne. And you get her for free. She does amazing AoE damage, as well as some relatively good single target damage, especially if there's only one target. That bounce does quite a bit of damage. Other than that, Ramoka is an excellent AoE damage dealer in this mode as well. So if you manage to pick her up from your selective summon, good for you. She'll make your life a lot easier on this boss. And then we move on to the sub DPS role. Starting off with Gray, you also get him for free. He is an amazing sub DPS as well as debuffer and buffer. He gives your team crit rate buff as well as providing defense break. Another option in the form of an SR is Dinah as well. She also provides a bunch of debuffs to your team while dishing out a relatively decent amount of damage. In fact, you can actually run Gray and Dinah together on the same team, because Gray, although he already defense breaks, Dinah can actually provide additional debuffs if the enemy is already defense broken. She'll do the vulnerability debuff, which increases damage taken, as well as another debuff, I forgot the name of it, but it basically increases crit damage taken, and it can actually even stack. So a very, very good PvE unit. And last, we have Hellkid, who can also function as a sustainer, I guess, because he provides shields, but he also dishes out relatively good damage as a sub DPS, and for the most part, AoE damage as well, which is really important in this boss fight. Also, before I move on to the supports here, I'd like to mention that if you happen to get very lucky or you re-rolled for any of the premium Moonlight or Light Dark 5-star characters or SSR characters, such as Messiah, Lily, or Doki Doki, Heinrich, you can definitely use them in any of these bosses. They are absolutely amazing for this PvE content. The thing is, I didn't really want to list them as suggested animuses because they are some of the hardest characters to get in the game. So I will only be listing SSR characters of the red, green, blue rarity, or SR characters as well. Alright, continuing on to the supports. First off, we have Chiaki, amazing 4-star or SR character. Gives your team attack buff, purifies or cleanses your team, also advances forward or provides turn meter. Next, we have Freya. She most likely will have her rate up banner upon release, although they may change it. Not too sure. This is based off on the previous beta. She's also a great buffer and debuffer as well as providing a little bit of advance forward, delay action, as well as healing. So she does a little bit of everything. Great for this boss. And of course we have Beatin. She has elemental advantage as well as some pretty nasty buffs as well as a very useful revive. She'll definitely be really good when it comes to PvE content. And then finally we have Klaus, who is just generally a very good debuffer in general. If you happen to pull her, definitely use her on this boss or any general PvE content. Alright, for the next Grim Pursuit boss, we have Phoebe, and she's also going to be a DPS check, although this one is more focused on your single target DPS check. What you want to do is bring some characters that can turn meter push or delay the boss, as well as have characters that have the ability to give your team immunity or cleanse them from debuffs. And believe it or not, this boss actually has 2 phases, so you're going to have to fight her twice. Each phase has a different gimmick. Regardless, the best way to tackle this boss is to basically nuke it. Ignore the ads. The ads are very annoying and can be hard to deal with in a prolonged fight. So as a result, like I said before, the best way to deal with this boss is to just focus down Phoebe and ignore the minions. She also snowballs out of control. She gets like stacks or some sort of ability that increases her damage dealt to you. Not to mention, I think one of her debuffs is a freeze. So you definitely want to avoid prolonging this fight. And she is actually going to be the first boss that starts dropping epic or the yellow grade shells. And there's 2 particular epic grade shells, the Black Flag and the Twilight Knight, that are extremely useful to you in the mid to early late game. And honestly, this is probably the first Grim Pursuit boss that you're going to be spending a lot of your energy and stamina on, so make sure you're able to clear this boss. And to help you with that, I'm going to suggest some characters or animuses that you can use. First off, of course, once again, we have Leanne, the free character that you get at the beginning of the game. I can't stress enough how important it is to build this character. An alternative and a very strong SR option is Victor. This guy does a lot of single target damage, and he's very tanky too, due to his survivability in his kit. So if you happen to pull him, which you probably should, he's an SR after all, he is very good in just general single target bossing content in the game, so highly recommend him. And once again, we move on to our sub DPS. It's pretty much the same. You got Gray for your defense break and crit rate buff, Dinah for your nasty debuffs, as well as some decent sub DPS damage. Hellkid for some decent damage as well, but his main selling point is his survivability and immunity that he provides for your team. And then moving on to the supports, once again we have Chiaki, Freya, and moving on to a new animus or character I'll be suggesting, and that is Marvel. He's an SR, so you can get him relatively easily. And what he does is he debuffs the enemy with speed down, and he also has a chance to push them back by quite a lot. He can also steal action bar value, so this way he can control the pace of the fight for your team. And last we have Klaus, who is just a generally good debuffer as well as action value manipulator. Okay, next we move on to Nico Nana, and the main gimmick for this boss is you have to have fast characters, or you need to have a way of buffing your character's speed or debuffing Nico Nana's speed. The reason for this is because she has high damage reduction against units that are slower than her speed. And like I mentioned before, one way to counteract this is to either have a speed buff for your team or have a speed down for the enemy boss. Or another alternative is to equip your damage dealers with the speed set, like a 12-piece speed set. Although to be noted, this will reduce their damage by quite a bit compared to some DPSs that have something like an attack set. And besides that, the main strategy to this boss is just to focus Nico Nana down, ignore the ads. She has also a snowball effect where if the fight takes too long, she actually gets a lot of attack and will eventually one-shot your team. And this is actually going to be the very first boss in the gateway to your mythic tier or your red tier pets. And some of these pets are even amazing in the end game, such as this. I believe this is called Alicorn. It's a cleansing pet. And then this pet right here is Gigabyte. Essentially, it is equivalent to Warhorn and Epic 7. It basically pushes up your characters every 3 enemy turns. So great for anti-cleave. Alright, and moving on to suggested animuses. Of course, we're going to have Leanne. There's almost never going to be a time where I don't recommend Leanne. There's only like a couple of bosses where she's not that great into, but for the most of them, she's one of the best damage dealers you can bring. Next, we have Rosa, and she is amazing in this fight, particularly because she is of the elemental advantage to Nico Nana, and she does a bunch of single target damage. She is one of the heaviest hitting single target damage characters in the game. So if you have a well invested Rosa, you should have no problem beating Nico Nana. And of course you have Victor, who is just an SR version budget of her that does the job fairly well as well. Alright, moving on to the support and sub DPS characters, we have Tsukiyomi. think that's how you pronounce her name. I could be wrong. Anyways, she is a blue elemental knight that can protect your team as well as provide... The most important thing is she provides speed buff, and she also advances forward the character. So this will allow you to counteract the defense reduction for Nico Nana. So she's a very, very good character if you happen to pull her. Next we have Fangus, and I put him here because he actually has a speed down debuff in his kit. Not only that, this is also the starting point where you can start running DOT teams if you've invested into DOT teams. He's the main damage dealer for DOT, and you can even pair him with the SSR version of Sanya if you were lucky enough to pull her. And then basically DOT is very strong in bossing content, so highly recommend it if you're going to go down that DOT route. If not, you can also just use them for the speed down, just to allow your DPS characters to deal more damage. And of course we have Marvel. He has the speed down as well as pushing back the enemy for preventing them from taking extra turns. An amazing SR character. And then the last recommended support character is Viper. He's also an SR. He has a speed down on his S3, and he's of elemental advantage, so he's also a very decent choice as well. Alright, next we have Sharon. There's not too much to discuss about this boss. Her main gimmick is she has very strong DOT damage. You basically need to bring immunity, or someone that can cleanse the DOT. Otherwise, just burst down this boss, DPS them as fast as you can. Just prolonging this fight will just result in you dying to her very strong DOT. And once again, for the suggested characters, what a surprise. We have Leanne and Victor again as the main damage dealers. Gray as our sub DPS. Dinah as our debuffer. Hellkid, once again, does fairly solid damage. Gives a little bit of survivability, and the immunity also helps with the DOT. As for the supports, we have Chiaki, once again, Freya, Bayotin, and Marvel. Very similar to a lot of the other suggested animuses. Alright, and Shadow Flame Hoyan is going to be the last Grim Pursuit boss I go over. There is probably going to be one more boss that releases upon release, and I believe his name is Roketsu or something. I didn't get a chance to test him out in the beta, so I don't know his mechanics that well, so I'm not going to discuss him, and he's like a super endgame boss that you probably won't reach until a couple months into the game. Alrighty, the main gimmick for this boss is that she's going to have 2 adds, and whenever you attack Shadow Flame Hoyan, these adds have a chance to counterattack and give the boss stacks. Upon reaching 7 stacks, I believe Shadow Flame Hoyan will actually do an AoE nuke, and this will basically wipe your team or be very close to wiping your team. So in order to prevent that, you need to bring characters that can hard CC or hard crowd control those mobs. On top of that, you also need to be able to control the turn meter in order to prevent Shadow Flame Hoyan from acting too often. And here are the suggested characters. Of course, we have Leanne. Rosa, very good, as she has very high single target damage. Victor, once again, very high single target damage, just an SR and easier to build. Now, I hate to mention this character, Kraken, because I absolutely hate his playstyle, but he is kind of essential for this fight, because he provides freeze, and that freeze can actually prevent the mobs from counterattacking, therefore slowing down the stacking on Shadow Flame Hoyan. So, he's an SR. If you have him, build him for this particular fight. He'll definitely be really useful. And then I want to mention both Obol and Fangus together. Obol has stuns, I believe, so that's also great for the mobs. But besides that, he can also be run with Fangus in a DOT team. And if you, like I said before, have the SSR version of Sanya, DOT works wonders in this particular boss fight. And of course you have Marvel for the turn meter delay as well as the speed slow on the enemy boss. Moving on to the sub DPS, you can use Gray and Dinah. They're both great for debuffing and buffing your team. And supports, once again, you have Chiaki, Freya, and Klaus, all of which have either turn meter push, debuffs, or turn meter pushback. Okay, now we have moved on to Threshold, which is the mode that you'll be farming for your gear, or matrices, as they're called in this game. And the first threshold we'll be going over is Teramaton. And the main gimmick for Teramaton is he has these 2 arms that help him in either an offensive or defensive way. And the key to beating this fight is to either control those arms or kill them off. The left arm attacks the lowest HP percentage ally and inflicts a nasty defense break, while the right arm gives the boss a defense buff and pushes up their turn meter. So in order to beat this boss, like I said, you need to either kill or control these arms to prevent the boss from snowballing. And to be noted, if any of your characters die to Teramaton on his turn, he will actually take an extra turn and do an AoE nuke, and this usually results in the wipe of your team. So you want to do everything possible to not let that happen and keep your team alive. In order to do this, I would recommend bringing characters that have a defense buff, shields, or heals in those slower runs. The best way, honestly, is just to nuke this boss down. If you have the damage, you don't even have to worry about trying to keep your team alive because you'll just be able to kill Termaton before he's able to snowball out of control. And this boss mostly drops DPS and HP scaling sets for your damage dealers, as well as your tanks that scale off HP, or your healers. Alright, and we'll move on to the suggested animuses. What a surprise! Leanne, once again, the character that they give you for free. She is probably the best character to use in this game mode. She was practically designed for Termaton. No reason not to build her up and use her. Victor is also another good choice. Very strong single target DPS character and SR character. For some reason, if you don't want to invest in a Leanne and you want to use Chloros here for some reason, he actually is a super endgame bossing unit, so he can also fit Leanne's role if you want to put the investment into him, or if you happen to pull him. Lastly, for the damage dealer slot, I have Ramoka here. She's great in the early to mid stages of Termaton, but once you get to the very difficult or even the Inferno tiers, she might be a little bit too frail to be used on this stage. Just to keep that in mind. But if you have one built up already for the upcoming Doki Doki threshold, you can also use her here in the earlier to mid-game stages. Alright, moving on to the sub DPS. We have Gray once again. Really good. Dinah, also really amazing as an SR. Hellkid is actually one of the best red units for this particular fight, although he's not needed. But if you want to run a more stable and safer run, his shields and immunity definitely help. Lastly, I would like to mention Veronica here. Normally, she's terrible when it comes to PvE content. She's mostly designed as a PvP character. But for the hardest difficulty of Termaton, she's actually very useful. Because not only does she provide a shield, but she's also able to steal buffs from the enemy. And this boss gets a 3-turn immunity at the beginning of the fight. So she can actually strip that immunity, and essentially she basically becomes an alternative version of Hellkid. And since Hellkid is one of the best characters, supportive characters, for this particular boss fight, there is no reason why Veronica wouldn't work. Alright, moving on to your support buffers, debuffers, etc. We have Beotin, very good. She also has a revive, so in case... Although if it comes to a point where your characters do end up dying, you probably will wipe, so don't rely on that. But she's still good regardless for this fight. Freya, of course, for the buffs and debuffs. And for turn meter pushback and speed down. I use this guy so much. He's actually so good in Termaton. Is Marvel. Chiaki as well, although make sure you build Chiaki a little bit more. At the higher stages, you don't want her getting killed. And then, of course, last but not least, we have Kloss for the debuffs and pushback. And like I mentioned before, the best way or strategy to deal with Termaton is to burst him down. However, if you don't have the DPS to do that, and you want to run a slower, safer run, not necessarily safer, but a slower run without one-shotting or killing the boss really quickly, you can bring a healer or sustainer. Sanya is pretty decent here, although not nearly as good compared to Valerian here at the bottom. In my opinion, Valerian's actually better, even though she doesn't technically heal. She's able to redistribute your character's HP to prevent one of them from being nuked down, and she even has a instance of preventing death, so that prevents Termaton from snowballing out of control. Alright, now we move on to the Doki Doki threshold, and this is probably going to be the domain or threshold that most people will be farming the most of. And the gimmick for this particular domain is all about AoE damage. You want characters that can multi-hit. Single target pretty much has no place here. On top of that, there's also a mechanic where the enemies take reduced damage by quite a bit if they're not hard CC. So you want to have characters that can either stun, freeze, or sleep the enemy. You also want to bring characters that can provide immunity or cleanse for your team because these enemies have very nasty debuffs, especially when they become empowered. They have defense down and stuns. Trust me, those stuns are really freaking annoying. And the main reason why this threshold is so popular is because it drops the speed set. And in any turn-based game, you want to have speed. You always need those speed drops. Besides that, it also drops some defensive sets, as well as a set called Bramble, which is essentially your counter set. Pretty good for your tanks that scale out defense, or characters that are slower and rely on their basic attack. Alright, on to some of the suggested characters for the Doki Doki domain. Starting off, we have Ramoka, who is by far the best in slot damage dealer in the game. If you have her, this threshold is basically easy mode, and I'll probably be picking her from the selective summon upon release. Next, we have Tiamat, who I did experience or use her in the second closed beta, or the second to last closed beta, etc., whatever you want to call it. She can clear the earlier and mid stages of Doki relatively easily, but once you get to the super endgame levels or the Inferno level, she can clear it still, it just takes a very goddamn long time. So unless you want to sit there or let it auto for like 4 to 5 minutes per run, with a chance of it failing, you can run Tiamat, but she is not the best choice. Like I said, she's better in the earlier stages, but once we get to the late stages, she does fall off. Next we have Shiada, I think that's how you pronounce her name. She is the exact opposite of Tiamat. She is not going to do that well early on, especially without proper investment, because her stats, she relies on high stats and a lot of buffs on her, but once you get to that end game and you have built her up properly and she has proper gear, she does a lot of AoE damage and it will stack up so quickly. Next we have some alternative DPS options. They're not the greatest and they won't really do that well once you get to Inferno mode, but they will clear the earlier stages fairly well. Starting off with Rahu, he's a defense scaling damage dealer, and not only that, he can benefit from the defense sets that drop from Doki Doki. Next we have Borgne. I did use him in the previous closed beta, and he did alright in the early to mid stages of Doki Doki, but once we got to the higher hell difficulties as well as Inferno, his DPS started falling off quite a bit. And last we have Lilith. She has the same issue. She's very strong early to mid game for Doki, but once you get to the harder stages, she doesn't do nearly as much damage. And I believe in Inferno, they actually inflict max HP reduction. So she scales off max HP, so her damage is basically gone. So she's not that great in the end game for Doki Doki. Moving on to the next two characters, I am basically going to characterize them as your hard CC characters. We have Kraken, of course, with his freeze, and I believe her name is Kazuyo. I think that's her name. I could be wrong. She has a very special sleep hard CC, and you can use that to counteract the damage reduction on Doki Doki. She's also an SR, so relatively easy to build and obtain. Next we have your supports and sub DPS characters. Of course, Gray, you get him for free. He's practically built for Doki Doki, and he's amazing with his defense down and crit rate buff, as well as his AoE. Freya, also amazing as well. If you want to pull her on her rate up banner, or if you get lucky and pull her, she's amazing for Doki Doki. Chiaki, a budget SR version of Freya, which might actually be better in some situations because she does have a cleanse or purify in her kit. Also amazing in Doki Doki. And of course Klaus, who is basically the previous rate up SSR that was made for Doki Doki. Great debuffs and pushback. Speaking of pushbacks, of course we have Marvel down here for that specific role as well. And for the last slot, I would recommend a sustainer or healer as well, and you have 3 options here available. Sanya is an SR and relatively easy to build, although you also get Ling Lo by day 7. I think Ling Lo is actually better, specifically in Doki Doki, just because of immunity and the fact that she can extend your buffs. Sanya is not bad though, don't sleep on her. She's easier to build up because she's an SR, and then Ling Lo, you get her like at day 7, so it will take you a while to build her up. Either way, both of these are great options. And unfortunately, if you don't have either of them, which is not possible because like I said, you get Ling Lo on day 7, you can still bring Valerian. She won't work as well because you definitely want the cleansing and immunity, but she can serve as a temporary sustainer, maybe for the earlier stages. Once you get to that late stage, I don't think she's going to work nearly as well as Sanya or Ling Lo. Alright, and finally, the last threshold boss is going to be Aurora. The main mechanic, or thing to play around on this boss, is she has very nasty debuffs that you absolutely need to get rid of or prevent her from putting on your characters. As a result, you're going to need a cleanser and immunity is required. Aside from that, she also has basically permanent immunity unless you remove it. Therefore, a dispeller is required. Otherwise, you'll never be able to land any debuffs. And if you've been building a DOT team, congratulations, you're in luck, because DOT teams or multi-hit teams are the best for this boss. Lastly, Aurora drops some of the best endgame PvP sets, although they're not really needed early on, but once you get into super endgame PvP, these sets can make or break the difference between a fight. Some of these sets include the Bloodbath set, which is a huge damage reduction set. It basically prevents any character that has this set from getting nuked down in one shot. You also have the Strive set, which is basically a turn meter or action advance set. Every time your character gets hit, they will get advance forward or their turn meter will be pushed up. And one of the most important sets, of course, is going to be the Bulwark set, or the immunity set. It's basically a one-turn immunity buff that prevents your character from getting debuffed at the beginning of the fight, unless, of course, it gets dispelled. Alright, let's move on to the suggested enemies. And the first one I'm going to suggest for a traditional DPS team is Rosa. She is basically the best traditional DPS character for this boss, mostly because she has a lot of hits in her kit, as well as a lot of single target damage. So if you chose Rosa as your character on your selector and you build her up, she will do very well, especially on the later stages of Aurora. Next, I put Fangus here because, like I said, DOT is probably the best way to deal with this boss, and he is going to be your main damage dealer, unless of course you have SSR Sanya, then you can bring her along to detonate all those DOTs. Basically, you want to run Fangus, Obel, and Sanya, or you can run Fangus, Sanya, or Obel, Sanya. Either way, any of those DOT teams will work. And then at the bottom here, these are two alternative damage dealers you can bring, although they're not very optimal. Tiamat, she's very tanky, but the runs will take literally forever, just like Doki Doki. She doesn't deal nearly as much damage as Rosa, and the damage that she deals is nothing comparable to a DOT team. But if you have a very heavily invested Tiamat, you can try to force your way through. Borgne is also a decent alternative. I did use him to try to clear some of the Aurora stages, but once I got to the higher levels, it didn't quite work out. He does relatively good damage, but the most important thing is he also strips. You can strip the immunity off of Aurora, so that's one really useful thing that he has against this boss. Not to mention he's also of the advantageous element. Next we have Obel. Basically good for DOT. He also converts the immunity into DOT, so very useful there. Then next we have Viper. He's mostly here for the Dispel, or the strip he has on his skill 3 or ultimate. The premium option here is obviously going to be Heinrich, but like I said before, I don't really like to mention the light dark SSRs, as they are very hard to get unless you specifically reroll for them or get lucky. So your budget version will be Viper. He's an SR, relatively easy to obtain and build. Next we move on to the supports and debuffers. First we have Marvel. He has speed down and turn meter pushback. Of course you're going to need to remove the immunity first before he's able to do that. Dinah, of course, for the debuffs. Once again, need to get rid of that immunity before she's able to do her job. Tsukiyomi, just for the general turn meter push as well as the really strong buffs. And Beoten, strong buffs as well as a revive in case something goes wrong, which it probably will, especially for this boss. And finally, last but not... No, she's definitely the most important, actually. Ling Lo, there's a reason why I made her portrait so large, is mandatory in this fight. Not only do you need a healer for this fight, you need a cleanser and someone that can provide immunity. She does all of that. She's of the advantageous element. You get her for free. There is absolutely no reason not to bring Ling Lo. She is a must. There is no other option in this last slot. So, there you go. Ling Lo is mandatory. And with that, we have finally come to the end of this PvE guide. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or if you have anything to add. And I'll see you guys upon global release for Etheria Restart on June 5th. But until then, take care and peace.